Exercise 6 deals with the integumentary system, which is dealing with the skin. In this picture, you can see that the skin is divided into these different layers of the epidermis, the dermis, and then the subcutaneous layer. So you have these multiple layers. The subcutaneous, the hypodermis layer is technically not part of the integumentary system, but it's always included with it because it's a layer right below it that helps to connect it, if you will, to the rest of the body. That's where a lot of the blood supply is initially coming from, etc. It does include accessory structures such as like your hair, your sweat glands, and so we'll discuss all of these different components of it. So what's the function of the integumentary system or the skin? Well, protection, insulation, cushioning, and hydration. It's also going to be involved with regulating your internal temperature. It's involved with excretion. There are a lot of various metabolic activities that are occurring, such as some of the precursors for making vitamin D, and then sensory receptors are also located here. Some of them are. So if you look at the structure, the superficial layer is the epidermis. It is composed of epithelial tissue. The dermis is deep to that. It is composed of connective tissue. So in this diagram in more detail, you can see that the upper layer is, or more superficial layer, is that epidermis layer. And then here you see the dermis, which is subdivided into the papillary layer and the reticular layer. Remember, because epidermis is epithelial tissue, there's one free surface. Underneath that, you have a basement layer that connects it to connective tissue, which we just said dermis is connective tissue. Because the epidermis is epithelial, there are nerves that will be throughout these layers, but no blood supply. Remember, it's avascular. Now, the connective tissue does have a very extensive blood supply. As you can see here, the arteries and veins that are throughout here. Now, the yellow here would be your nerves. But the blood vessels themselves do not extend into that epidermis. You do have the hair follicles. You do have sweat glands and oil glands that are associated with the integumentary system. You do have various receptors. This is what some of these are that are able to pick up different stimuli. If we look at the various cells that are present in the epidermis, you have keratinocytes, which produce keratin, melanocytes, which produce melanin. That's going to be involved with determining skin color, and that's going to be genetic. Mostly genetic, also some environmental aspects to it. The Langerhans cells or dendritic cells, which are phagocytes, so that's going to be some of the protective cells. And the tactile or Merkel cells, which are some of your touch receptors. The epidermis itself is multi-layered and has different layers, 4 or 5 layers, depending on the location of the body. So if we work deep and work towards more superficial, the different layers are the stratum basal, the stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, stratum lucidum, and then the stratum corneum is the most superficial. So that's the one that you actually see. The stratum lucidum is found only on the palms and on the soles of the feet, where you have a lot of extra wear and tear and friction. So in this diagram, it is showing you a picture from a slide and then a schematic drawing showing these different layers. Now this is showing just the 4 layers. Down here is the dermal layers, the cells down on the stratum basal. This is where the cells are actively going through mitosis and dividing. Typically one cell stays and the other daughter cell gets pushed up. By the time you are in the stratum corneum, these cells are dead. They have broken down. They're not able to get nutrients. They're too far away from any blood supply. And so they have broken down. So yes, it's true that most of what you see is dead. The dermal layer is dermis divided into two sublayers. The papillary layer, which tends to be thinner than the reticular layer, which lies underneath it. The papillary layer is the areolar connective tissue. It is highly vascular. It does contain nerve endings, has a lot of the touch receptors. It does contain these what we call dermal ridges. That's what helps to produce your fingerprints, which, by the way, that is also genetically determined, and that is unique to you. The reticular layer is dense, irregular connective tissue. Once again, it's also vascular. This does contain your sweat glands, your sebaceous glands. Some of the pressure receptors are located here as well. So once again, showing the epidermis, and then the dermal, and the divisions of the papillary layer versus the reticular layer. Just so you know, with the epidermis being avascular, all of you have experienced getting a paper cut. You feel it because there are nerve endings in the epidermal layer. It may not always bleed. Well, why is it that sometimes it bleeds and sometimes it doesn't? It just depends on how deep it is. If it's very shallow, where you only went through the epidermis, there's no blood vessels there, so it's not going to bleed. Now, there are nerve endings, so you're going to feel it. You're going to know you cut your finger. If it bleeds, that means you did cut down to the dermis, because that's where the blood vessels are. And once again, there's lots of nerve endings in both the epidermis and the dermis, so you're going to know it. Skin color is determined by a combination of things. Melanin, which is a pigment, keratin, which is a pigment, and then the amount of oxygenation of the blood. Melanocytes do produce melanin, which is this dark colored pigment, as you can see here. It's often referred to as nature's sunblock because it tends to form more superficial to the nucleus. It's like it's protecting the DNA in the nucleus. As you can see here, here's a melanocyte, which is producing that melanin. Someone who has a darker pigmentation of their skin, if you want to think of it as their melanocytes, are much more efficient because they're producing more pigment than someone who is lightly colored skin. And it tends to make sense if you think about it, that individuals who originally from areas that have very strong sunlight, like closer to the equator, where their exposure to UV light would be potentially much more intense. UV light is a carcinogen, as you know, it can cause cancer, the long-term exposure to it. So it's a natural protective mechanism that you've got the melanin being produced in greater amounts than, say, in individuals further away from the equator where the sunlight would be less intense, the exposure to sunlight might be less, so there would be less need potentially to have that protection. Some of the accessory organs that are found associated with the integumentary system, your nails, your hair, your cutaneous glands. So we'll look at these. The nails, there are different components of the nail. The main part is the body. You've got the free edge, the hyponychium, the root, the nail folds, the cuticle, the nail bed, nail matrix, and what's normally referred to as the white of the nail, the lanulae, where you see here. The body here is obviously the free edge over here. You've got the cuticle. Now, when you look at a lateral view, here is the nail. It does extend, obviously, underneath the skin here, as everyone is aware. This is where it is actively growing and it's pushing it out in this direction. Why does it look pink underneath here? It's because underneath the nail bed you do have extensive blood supply that is given that kind of a pinkish coloration to it. Nails can tell us a lot, at least provide us some information as to the health of the patient, which is why oftentimes when a patient is undergoing their initial evaluation, someone may just kind of casually look at their nails. It's also a reason why anyone who is undergoing things such as radiation chemotherapy, they will want the patient to not put nail polish on so they can help. It gives them extra clues in monitoring the overall health of the individual. They will also, in terms of forensics, is different chemicals will concentrate in nails, and so if you have a suspicious death, they're probably going to take some nail clippings and run a chemical analysis and drug analysis on that, because there are several chemicals that will accumulate in the nails. The hair, different regions or layers of the hair, you've got the medulla, the cortex, and the cuticle. Just something to keep in mind, because you're going to see this throughout your studies of A&P, is that when you see especially medulla and cortex, medulla is usually going to be center, and then the cortex is going to be outside or surrounding the medulla. And then in this case, you do have the cuticle. You have the hair shaft and the hair root. The hair bulb is at the base of the hair follicle. So this is a cross-section of a hair with its follicle. And then when we look at it, the hair matrix, this is where the cells are actively dividing. The hair papillae is providing all of the nutrients, so those cells can actively divide, go through cell division. And then you do have the hair follicle wall, as shown here on these cross sections. So you have, once again, the papillae here, which is providing all of those nutrients, the hair matrix, which is where the cells are actively growing and being pushed up. Once again, all this is occurring down here in what was known as the hair bulb. So the cells are being pushed up. This is referred to as the hair follicle. The hair shaft is once it is above the surface, and what you're seeing here, these cells are dead at this point. The Arrector Pili muscle is right here. As you can see, it is attached to the hair follicle and then will be attached here. And as we'll see in a moment, when that muscle contracts, it's going to pull these hair follicles up, straight up, and that's what is the appearance of goosebumps then. So that Arrector Pili muscle is a smooth muscle, so you don't have any control over it. It's involuntary. And like I say, that's what causes the goosebumps. So you can see here where it is relaxed, the hair is down, and then once it contracts, it pulls it up. Part of that is when you're frightened, you might wonder if I'm startled, why do I get goosebumps? So it makes you look bigger. This is, if you have a cat, you're probably familiar with this, that when your cat gets startled, how it looks all fluffy and bigger. It's a survival mechanism. In terms of the glands, the cutaneous glands, you have sebaceous glands, which are oil glands. These will usually empty into the hair follicle. They will produce an oily substance that does act as a lubricant, that is the sebum. It does have some bactericidal components to it, in that it will help prevent infection by bacteria. Should they travel down that oil gland, it's going to kill them. It does help keep the hair nice and soft and smooth. And then you've got your sweat glands or your sudoriferous glands. These empty through pores directly onto the surface of the skin. So if it's emptying into the hair follicle, it's a sebaceous gland. If it's emptying through pores onto the surface of the skin, it is sudoriferous or sweat gland, of which there are two types. Eccrine, which is also known as merocrine. These are all over the body. These produce sweat or perspiration. And then the apocrine glands, which are found in the axillary and genital areas, And these usually become activated during puberty. So this is showing right here your sebaceous glands that, as I said, are attached to the hair follicles, versus right here is a sweat gland, how it empties in onto through the pore, through the ductwork onto the skin itself. There's one here, there's the pores here and here and here. In terms of dermography, looking at fingerprinting, your fingerprints are unique to you. It's determined genetically. There's different patterns known as arches and loops and whorls, and it does take a lot of training to be able to identify these and compare them. So taking fingerprints, comparing them, and being able to identify some of these very particular does this fingerprint taken from, say, in criminology, from a crime scene, doesn't match a certain individual. But the fingerprints, the ridges, it does help to give you more grip. So that's why you find them on the fingers and your toes. It helps you to grip. Like if you were, think about if you were on a really smooth, slick floor. If you didn't have those ridges, we'd all be slipping and sliding all over the place. So trying to grab, like with our hands, being able to grab a glass, it would be much harder if we did not have these ridges that help to provide extra grip.